Hi, my name is John Threet. I was born in Pendleton, Oregon in 1965. My parents had gone out there. My father had started a church out in Pendleton, Oregon, and we moved back to Arkansas, which is where both sides were from, before I was 1 year old, so I don't remember anything about it.
Tell me about your parents and how you ended up in Arkansas.
They've always been in Arkansas as far back. My parents got to Arkansas, I can't remember how many generations ago, because they've just always been in Arkansas that I can remember. My father and his family were in basically the Harrison area. My mother and her family were basically in northeast Arkansas and in the Delta region, in those two places. And then met here in the 50s, where my father was in ROTC and getting his ag degree. He went 2 years down at Arkansas Tech in Russellville, and back then you did 2 years at Tech and you'd transfer up to the U of A and go ahead and finish your ag degree. And so he was there when he met my mother, when she started going there when she was, I think, 16 years old, because she'd run out of all the high school classes to take at a little town called Sulphur Rock outside of Batesville, Arkansas. And so they had moved up here. My uncle was playing basketball for the Hogs back in the 50s. And so the family just moved over here. My mom started going to college, and they met at the BSU. Now they're called BCMs, but the Baptist Student Union. And that's where they met in the 50s at the U of A and got married.
Talk about where you lived and where you went to school when you were growing up.
I always tell people I'm from Springdale, because that's the longest we lived in one place as a family. My father was the preacher at Johnson Baptist Church, which is a little town in between Fayetteville and Springdale. And so that's why I tell people we were from there. We actually had moved from a little town called Pleasant Plains probably in 1969. After my parents, they left Washington County after they graduated college and traveled around. But we were living in Pleasant Plains, Arkansas, outside of Batesville, and came to Fayetteville in '69, and then moved to Springdale in 1970.
Where did you go to school, and what was it like?
Went to kindergarten in Fayetteville, just down the street. There were two big houses. One is still standing right off of college. The other one got torn down, I don't remember how many years ago, but I was living here when they tore it down. Then I started at Lee Elementary in Springdale, which is just on Quant Street, which is about 4 streets over from downtown Emma. And we lived, now our house still standing there, but it's on Don Tyson Boulevard. It used to be a dead-end dirt road, but now it's, the boulevard, the Tyson Boulevard. We lived there, and our bus route went down to the Johnson Mill, up New Hope Road, and they took us all the way to downtown Springdale for elementary, and then they built John Tyson Elementary, and I was one of the first classes in John Tyson Elementary. And then after completed 6th grade, we moved outside of Chicago, and then to Central Arkansas, 3 different places in Illinois, and then back after 3 years in Illinois, back to Central Arkansas, and then I came back up here in 1989.
You had mentioned before the interview that you remember the old Johnson Mill when you were a kid.
The Johnson Mill, what I remember about the Johnson Mill, when I was a kid, it was still running. It was still the Johnson Mill. My mother would buy cornmeal there and flour. Frank Johnson, who lived in the house across the street, which is now a bed and breakfast, went to our church. And I remember being in that house back when I was a little kid. But I specifically remember going into the mill because that's where we bought flour and cornmeal, so when it was still a going concern at the time.
You said as a preacher's son you moved around a little bit and eventually ended up back in Arkansas. How did you end up back in Washington County?
Law school. I came back to Washington County in 1989 I think it was 89, to attend law school. I know I graduated in 90 from law school, so I moved back up here, and my roommate, who had been my roommate in college, as well as law school, we both came up here, and then I just never left. Again, I never left Washington County again since 1989.
So how did you end up after, what did you do after law school that basically eventually ended you up doing public service?
What I did right after law school that has kept me in the county system, Washington County system, pretty much my entire life since law school. Well, not pretty much, it has been. I started clerking my 3rd year in law school at the public defender's office. Denny Haislip was the public defender and still is. When he's from Mariana, and my grandfather used to preach at Mariana, be a preacher at Mariana, and Denny went to my grandfather's church in Mariana. And I started clerking for them my 3rd year of law school, and after I graduated from law school, they hired me. Someone had left the office, and so they hired me in the public defender's office, and I was there for 3 years. And then I started in the prosecutor's office when Terry Jones was elected in '93. Then I came over to the prosecutor's office, and when I was in the prosecutor's office in '98, I guess it was, he named me his chief deputy for 8 years. I was the elected prosecutor, and then 2014 I became the circuit judge, and so I started the term in 2015 as a circuit judge, and have been in that position ever since.
Talk to me about what it was like working for Denny Haislip. What was that? What was your daily routine like? I mean, how busy were you?
When we started in the public defender's office, when I started daily life, you went to court just about every morning in the public defender's office. In the afternoon, you would, if you had appointments, if you had people who had called to come in and talk about their case, you would see them. When we started, it was in the basement of what I think was the old Montgomery Ward building. It's not standing there anymore. You know where the owl's painted on the side of the building? Well, next to it, there was a building, and in the basement, with no windows, was the public defender's office. And that's where we were, and where I was for 2 years, there in the basement. No windows. You could open up, if you looked hard enough, you could see out into the alley between our building and the old Mountain Inn, which at that time had become condemned and nothing was there. I mean, it was a dismal, dismal location. And after that, though, they bought the current courthouse when it, I guess First South Bank went under. They bought this building, and I moved in as a public defender. We were on the first floor of this building where we now are located. But I remember when we first came into this building, because there was a dentist office. The top floor was Transmontane Oil. There were on the bottom floor, in the corner, there was a hairstylist or something to that effect. And there was still a bank on the second floor, because I still used that bank while it was there for a while, before the county condemned and took over the entire building for the courthouse.
What was the caseload like back then?
The caseload was clearly smaller than it is now, but you also had a lot fewer people working. When I came into the prosecuting attorney's office in 1993, we had 4. There were 4 prosecutors handling all of the felony cases. Do you want the names, or?
If you remember.
Let's see, myself, in the original group when Terry Jones became the prosecutor, there was a guy named Bruce Rhodes, myself, Dale Varner, and Denise Smiley. We were the 4 prosecutors that handled all of the felony cases. And we went up to 5 a few years later, but we stayed at that number for a long time, even though the caseload kept growing and growing. And now what they have in felonies, you'd have to ask Matt Durrett, my former chief deputy, what they are, but I think it's maybe 15 or so, 16 or so, but the numbers have certainly got larger. When I started out, we were in the old courthouse, in the public defender's office. We were in the old courthouse down the street, and Malin Gibson, I can remember, was the criminal judge that we went before. And I can remember they kept, when they'd bring prisoners up for court, there was usually a handful at most, 3 or 4, and they would just sit in some chairs next to the wall. But then it eventually got where they were filling up the jury box and then some extra seats. We kept growing through the years, it just became more and more, and it was obvious. You could see it. You could observe that we have grown because the handful of prisoners no longer fit in those chairs next to the door.
Talk about the change you saw over the years in the prosecutor's office from the time you were working for Terry until your tenure and then through Matt.
Well, I mean, as far as change, it would just be the numbers that's really changed. The crimes have always been pretty much the same, that same type of crimes. Hot checks are not as frequent as they once were, but the numbers have grown, so the staff has grown, the number of prosecutors has grown. Everything just keeps getting larger and larger because you have such an influx in the number of people who now are living in Washington County.
How has the problems with drugs and alcohol been a huge challenge for the prosecutor? I don't know that it's any more or less of a challenge than any of the other crimes because the numbers have simply gone up for all the crimes across the board. Homicides, we have more homicides now than we used to. I can remember a stretch in the prosecutor's office where we went several years without an actual homicide or actual murder. You would have a homicide that either be ruled justified. I can remember one year there was one where the guy committed suicide, so you had no one to prosecute. But then that stretch ended and it's never looked back, and it's only grown. So just the numbers have gone up. They're probably not as bad number-wise as people might think, but you have such extreme coverage by local media that they hear them so many, and they cover hearings, and so it may be higher than people think it is. I think the crime rate itself, the violent crime rate in Washington County is probably, as compared to population, is probably still fairly low based on what our population actually is. Talk about some of the deputies that you had when you were the prosecutor. I know Matt was your chief deputy and he took over, but kind of talk about some of the crew you had and what kind of work they did.
Well, the people that were working there while I was there, no prosecutors are left when I started. When I started for Terry Jones in '93, none of those prosecutors are left, and actually several of the hires after that, a few years after that, have not. And Matt Durrett is still there. Matt Durrett is still there. He was hired, I want to say, in '98 when he was hired, and he is still there and is now the current prosecuting attorney. When I became the prosecutor for those 8 years, he was my chief deputy. There are still a few that I hired on that are still there, but everybody that started when I did in '93, they've all long since been gone.
Talk about some of the judges that you tried cases in front of.
Well, Malin Gibson was the first one that I worked in front of, and that was as the public defender, and that was down at the old courthouse. After he left and right before I went into the prosecutor's office, Judge Story, Bill Story, he initially was appointed, and I can't remember the term, I don't remember if they, when they changed the juvenile code, at the time Governor Bill Clinton appointed him as basically the juvenile judge for juvenile court. So I went in front of him because I was still in the public defender's office, and one of my duties was handling juvenile court. So that's when I first met Judge Story. And then he ran for and won after Malin Gibson retired as the criminal judge.
he ran and became the criminal judge here, and he was the criminal judge up until I started in circuit. He left circuit court and is now, of course, the Fayetteville district judge, but he left circuit court at the exact same time that I left the prosecutor's office and became a circuit judge. And those were the two that I was mainly in front of. Judge Smith, Kim Smith, he was the prosecutor for several years. Then he became a circuit judge, and for a while he took a percentage of the criminal cases, so I would work in front of him as well. Some of them that we did, like mental commitments, the prosecutor's office did, so we would go on occasion to handle mental commitments in front of Judge Butt, who his office was this one. When they originally took over this building and became the county courts and the prosecutor's office and all that, Judge Butt's office was this one. And then Judge Lineberger was on the other end, John Lineberger, and we had some mental commitments in front of him. But the vast majority of the criminal cases that we had were in front of Judge Story, and then a smaller percentage, Judge Lindsay, Mark Lindsay, who had this office after Judge Butt, handled a percentage of the criminal cases back then.
How would you describe Judge Smith and Judge Story?
Really good, easy to work with, no nonsense. Judge Smith was easy to make fun of. He wore short sleeve shirts a lot with his ties, and in fact there is a photograph in those bookshelves of a bunch of us who wore short sleeves and ties that were too short and went into his office when he was gone one day to take a picture. And we put the words on it that it was the Judge Smith look-alike contest sponsored by the local union of the copy repairman, or something to that effect. And some of the guys didn't have dress shirts that were short sleeves, so they just took a long sleeve one and just cut the sleeves off. But we were always making fun of Judge Smith for wearing it. He'd always say they're a lot cooler in the summer, and I'm sure they were. But he did look like a copy repairman with his short sleeve dress shirts and neckties. But Judge Story is still on the bench and was really, conscientious and concerned about the cases that he heard. And he was real good to go in front of. Both of them were.
I assume all your ribbing of Judge Smith was all in good fun because you liked him?
Well, sometimes, but most of it was, yes. I mean, we're still in Rotary Club together, and we still make fun of each other. It's not just my making fun of him. He's been real active still in the Historical Society, and he's still practicing law to a degree. I decided to run for judge at the time, probably several reasons, but Judge Story was retiring from the bench, which had an opening, and probably after 26 years or so in criminal law, it was probably time to try something else. You may not notice it at the time when you're going through it, but especially the last 8 years, but probably 10 to 12 years, I would go out on all the homicides in Fayetteville, Springdale, Washington County. So I'd go out to all the homicide scenes and dealing with that and the victims' families. After a while, that probably makes you a little tired of having to deal with such horrific violence, and then dealing with the families that have been devastated by one of their family members being brutally murdered. And so I decided to give circuit court a shot, and I tell people it's like any other job. Some days are all right, some days are not as all right. It just varies on what you're having to hear and decide, and how complicated the issues are.
What's the hardest part of being a circuit judge?
There's several probably to me difficult aspects, but as far as difficulty, it's probably the domestic cases, especially when you're dealing with custody and visitation, when the parents can't agree. And so you, as the judge, you listen to both sides, and anyone else who has input into which ones should have, custody, which ones should have visitation, and those are pretty horrible at times. And sometimes they're not as difficult to decide. I can remember one time on a guardian, it's custody, I guess, where the father of the child, and they had not married, had filed to get custody of the child with the mother, and the mother walked in the courtroom with a guy before the hearing started, and she came and sat at the table for the parties, and the guy she came in with stayed out in the audience. And when she took the stand, the father's attorney asked her, where are you living right now? And she said, I'm living in Bella Vista, and she pointed at the guy she walked in with and said, I'm living in Bella Vista with Mike Reynolds. And the guy she walked in with stood up and said, my name is Steve. And I thought then, no, that's probably not going to be that difficult of a decision to make in this particular case when you're not really that familiar with the person you're living with. But a lot of them are difficult.
What are some things maybe that people don't understand about a judge's job? What are some things that people may not know about it?
Well, probably they may not realize that it takes a lot of reading, especially in civil cases. For me, it takes a lot of reading the files of the pleadings, what's been filed, what they're claiming the facts are, what they're claiming the law is. And to me, civil is so expansive. There's so much of it, and it covers so many aspects. For me, there's a lot of research involved too. So that can be really time consuming. I think a lot of people may think a judge sits on the bench, hits the hammer, and just says next, and hears for a little while, then says, we're not doing that, next. Some judges may do that somewhere. I don't know. I've never met one that did. But I think the amount of reading that it takes, I don't think people may not realize that it takes a lot of time to read through the files so that you can understand the facts of what is going on and what the parties are claiming.
Similarly, what about prosecutor? What are things that people don't realize about the prosecutor's job?
Probably as far as the elected prosecutor, they probably don't realize the amount of pressure and stress it is on the elected prosecutor. When I was the elected prosecutor for those 8 years, especially with the advent of social media, I was contacted constantly on cases. A lot of times by people I didn't even know, and a lot of times cases that weren't even in my office. But when you're the elected, you are responsible for, whatever crime occurs, felonies, and misdemeanors outside of incorporated cities. And your phone rings constantly. You're constantly getting emails, text messages. When I'm not sure people realize when a crime occurs, especially a big crime, you're immediately sought after for answers by the media, police, victim's family, defense attorney, and all that is directed to you. And when you're the prosecutor, especially with homicide and stuff, you get called at 2 or 3 in the morning, you go out to homicide scene. And for the elected prosecutor, you don't just do it with Fayetteville cases, you do it with Springdale cases, you do it with county cases, Prairie Grove, wherever it may have occurred. You're going to go out to that scene. And for the Washington County prosecutor, you do it for Madison County too. Now, that's changed in effect that I don't have to actually go out to the scenes, but as a circuit judge who is required to read and sign off on a search warrant, this past Sunday I got called at 2 o'clock in the morning and woke up and waited for the police to show up at my house so I could review a search warrant to sign to determine if there was probable cause to issue the search warrant. So that still happens, but I don't have to get in my car and drive to wherever that scene may be anymore and spend several hours out there trying to figure out what happened.
What are some other things you can think of maybe I haven't thought to ask you about, or some things or memories that stand out over the years?
I don't know as far as memories that stand out, because a lot of them would be murder cases that I really don't want to talk about for different reasons. One of the things that stands out in my mind when the public defender's office was still on the bottom floor, and the prosecutor's office, which is still mainly on the third floor, but they're also on the bottom floor too. One of the public defenders called me one day when I was on the third floor in the prosecutor's office and said if a guy turned in some bombs that he had, some explosives that he had, would he get in trouble? And I said, no. If we wouldn't get it otherwise, to make it safer, then yes. If he just turns over whatever he's got, then that'd be fine. And he said, well, good, because he's coming over. And I said, coming over where? And he said, coming over to my office to drop it off. Well, he called me later and said he dropped the stuff off, which I wasn't clear that he was actually coming over to bring it. And I said, well, let me come down. So I go down the first floor. The guy comes to his office, and I'm talking to the attorney, and it's these, you see in the movie what they call plastique or whatever, these clay-looking bars, and then there was these plastic bottles with some liquid in them. And I told the attorney, I said, I don't know explosives. I don't know what this stuff is. It could be. It looks like it. I asked him, what are you doing here in your office? And he said, I wasn't until you said you wanted to come down and look at it. And I said, well, I need to I need to tell the county judge. I said, I don't think we should touch it because I don't know what it is. So I went up and told the county judge, and they evacuated the entire courthouse. And later that day on the news, I saw, because they evacuated the whole courthouse and everybody had to go home for the day, that the bomb squad came, went ahead and blew it up, determined that it was modeling clay and glue. But one of the things that happened when they closed it, they used to announce that they were going to make their filing announcements, people who ran for office there in the atrium. And they also said that somebody who was getting ready to run for office had to cancel it because they'd closed down the courthouse. That stuck out in my mind. The fact when I went down there and thought, what are you doing here with this bomb stuff? And of course the question was, what was I doing there with it? But I can remember that.
What about some of the you've worked with a lot of different sheriffs over the years. Tell me about how are they different?
When I started clerking, I guess, at the public defender's office, or at least when I started working in the public defender's office, Bud Dennis was leaving. Kenneth McKee came in right after Bud Dennis. Both of them were real nice guys. Both of them were real conscientious about their jobs. Steve Whitmill actually came in right after Kenneth McKee, and then Tim Helder. Actually, there was an interim. Lee Owen was the interim sheriff, and Lee had been with the county sheriff's office for a long time, and he'd actually been the Benton County sheriff, I'm pretty sure, and he'd been a federal marshal. He was the interim, and then Helder came in and has been there ever since. And the thing about Washington County is they're the friendliest people you'll ever meet. Of course, so much of their time is consumed with the jail, because as we've grown, so have the needs of the jail and their population. I do not remember them using the old jail that looks like a castle down by the old courthouse, but I do remember when the jail was built there on College, which is now Regional Correctional Facility, or whatever the acronym is now, a female unit there, and now of course the new jail is down south. I do remember when they were filming Fighting Mad, a fairly horrible movie in this area, but it was a Jonathan Demme movie, which is real surprising how bad that movie was. But it had Scott Glenn in it. It had Peter Fonda was the main character. Gino Franco, who was one of the city prosecutors for Springdale, was Peter Fonda's son in the movie. But they used the old jail as the jail in the movie, or at least the outside of it. I can remember from the movie. My father-in-law, Jim Whitehead, my wife's father, he was co-founder of the creative writing program. He actually had 2 or 3 scenes in one speaking role in that particular movie. But it was a bad movie. But I just remember the old jail was used for that purpose, is to be in the movie.
What other stories can you think of? Maybe stuff I hadn't thought to ask about.
I don't know. I remember early on elections were a lot more fun because they used to, and I don't remember if it was the Hilton or originally when they were doing it, and you probably remember back on election night, and again, this you probably were, they were probably using cell phones, maybe, but you certainly didn't you couldn't walk around with the internet. But I can remember when both Republicans and Democrats would get together at the hotel off the square, and would get the big banquet rooms, and someone would stand there with the chalkboard and would update that chalkboard on those races. And Republicans and Democrats would all be in that same room talking and stuff. I'm not sure you could do that today, even if people wanted to. But I can remember that specifically because that was always fun. That was always fun to go down on election night because everybody was going to be there. Both sides would be there, all the politicians and everybody watching that chalkboard because they were getting updates from when they were counting. They would call over there and then they would update the chalkboard. So it was a lot of fun to see everybody together. They quit doing that years ago. Now people seem to have their own individual parties. I believe the Democrats and Republicans have their own individual parties, and candidates will have their own individual parties, but it used to be just one big party, and excuse me, and everybody would go.
You talked earlier about doing some work as in juvenile court,
Mm-hmm.
and we've seen huge changes since your time here in that juvenile system. Can you talk a little bit about what they've done?
Probably one of the things that stands out the most to me is, of course, like everything else, the numbers go up. But I can remember when the red house just south of here was the juvenile detention center. I think it housed up to 10 kids or something like that, but it was the house. And then they built behind what was then the sheriff's office. They built a new juvenile detention center, which was quickly outgrown. And then they built the complex down south by the county jail, which has the juvenile detention center as well as the courtroom. When I started and doing juvenile work, the juvenile court was on the top floor of the building where the public defenders were in the basement. And I called it the fun house a lot of times because the floor would be swelled up in the middle, and you know it had the horrible looking wood paneling. It was a real sad and depressing place to be, let alone the fact you were there because there was a problem or an issue, either criminal or otherwise. And so that has come a long way, certainly, from when they started. A lot of it seemed to be the county doing the best they could with whatever space was available to build, you know, and to add on at the time. But then the county just continually grew. And so they had to keep coming up with new places to go, bigger places.
How helpful to the judges and to the prosecutors is it to be able to do the arraignments in the court and stuff down there at juvenile and at the jail instead of having to transfer the prisoners?
Yeah, well, you know, that benefit would be mainly for the jail, but it would be also mainly, or also an ancillary beneficiaries would be the citizens, because it saves money on transport, but also safety. because you're not transporting that number of prisoners. So the judges divide up time. Some of the judges divide up time and go down Monday, Wednesday, and Friday to that small courtroom that when they built the new jail, they designed a small courtroom in there as well, so that all arraignments and hearings that were required to be done with prisoners could be done down there. And that way then just one person, well, maybe two, the court reporter and maybe a couple others, and the attorneys go down there, as opposed to bringing all the prisoners up, because you may have between 8.1 hearings, which is the very first appearance, and arraignments, you may have 60, 70. And instead of transporting, and not all of those are in custody, but a good number are, instead of having to transport all of those people up to courtrooms at the courthouse, the judge just goes down and they just come through the side door where the jailers are, and just do one after another that way. So that saves a whole lot of time in transport.
This is a little off topic here, but you know, over the years, the number of people in jail has gone up, or prison. As you've seen that both as a prosecutor and a judge, even though you don't do really much criminal stuff or a lot. But what do you see as the root causes of that huge increase?
It's just the number of people. That's going to be always going to be an ancillary problem. Is when, you know, population explodes, a lot of things are going to go up, but crime is going to be one of them. And I think that's what's happened. And having started out in about 1989, I have personally observed and seen, not only, but you've got stats and numbers showing how many crimes are committed now, how many criminal charges are filed now, but I personally have been able to observe the number of people that come through criminal court, and how long it takes to get through criminal court because of the numbers.
If someone came to you and said, Judge Threet, what's the best way for a young person to stay out of jail or prison, what would you tell them?
Well, keep your hands to yourself, for one thing. I used to, when I would talk to younger groups, I'd tell them the ABCs. Always be where you're supposed to be. No, A was always keep your hands to yourself. B was be where you're supposed to be. C, choose to tell the truth. And it's, basic, and it sounds silly, but if you don't want to get in criminal trouble, don't commit crime. I tell different groups that I talk to of students, don't stay out after midnight. Just because you say you're not participating in something that's questionable, whether it's abuse of drugs or abuse of alcohol, once you get in with that crowd, it makes it a lot more difficult to stay away from that type of activity. But I mean, it's basic stuff. People know that. I don't think people, when they get into trouble, they were confused and didn't think, for the most part, didn't think it was wrong. They probably knew that it was wrong. They just weren't counting on getting caught, and certainly weren't thinking about the consequences of whatever their actions were.
One time in an interview, just kind of informal, you told me, as I recall, that you thought alcohol was one of, if not the worst drug problem.
Yeah.
Explain explain that comment and what you meant by
Because it seems to me that alcohol can be one of, or is often the worst drug that we have, or the abuse of alcohol would be one of the worst drugs that we have, is because it seems like so many of the calls that are responded to are alcohol related. When I used to ride with, when I was in the prosecutor's office, I would ride in Springdale, I'd ride in Fayetteville, overnight shift with a patrol officer, just to see what they're doing, get to know some of the officers, and because I thought it was a lot of fun. And it seemed like, especially in Fayetteville on the weekends, every call you responded to, it was somebody who was intoxicated. It didn't matter if it was a fight that broke out or someone that had stolen something or whatever the problem or the issue was. It seemed like in 98% of all the calls, alcohol was involved. Now, the abuse of drugs is clearly a problem or issue too. It's just I personally observed a lot more alcohol abuse related calls than I did drug related calls. But that's just from personal observation. That's not from any scientific evidence or data.
What challenges did you face in the prosecutor's office when you left? I mean, what were the challenges that Matt inherited?
I can remember, for me, because my docket is now all civil, domestic, and probate, I had spent my entire career in criminal law. So for me, it was all brand new. So it took a lot of reading. It took a lot of asking questions of how these things work. And it took a lot of research to get comfortable with all of that. As far as Matt is concerned, one of the things that I told him before I left the office, and I told him, I don't think telling you this will make a difference because until you experience what it's like to be the elected, you just can't understand it. But I told him, your life is going to change. You are now going to be the center of a lot of explosions. You're going to be the target for a lot of people wanting to have answers, wanting to know why something happened. And I said it's can be horrible at times, but and I don't think telling somebody that and then having them experience it are two different things. Once you experience it, then you realize, this is a constant stress. Constant stressor is the constant attention that you get because your name's on the front door, and that's the way it goes. And if you don't want that, then don't take a job where your name's on the front door of a prosecutor's office, because you're going to get hammered constantly by a lot of different people. But that's the way it goes. I knew that because I'd observed it in the office for those years that I'd been in there, and so I understood that, and I knew it would come, and it did.
What have you enjoyed the most about your public service?
In the prosecutor's office, a lot of it, feeling this is my area, Washington County, and I've always said this, Washington County is my home. It's my wife's home. She's lived all but a couple of years here in Washington County. My children, both grown and raised in Washington County. In the prosecutor's office, anytime that you could nail somebody who needed a nailing, somebody who needed off the street and did not need to be on those streets again, I could never replicate the feeling of if you'd been in a trial for days and you'd put all this time and effort and work and this guy was really dangerous and really violent and the jury comes back and says guilty. I can't replicate that feeling because then you know that this guy, depending on the sentence, but if it was something that carried life, for instance, you knew this guy was never going to be able to be a threat to anyone ever again on your streets, on the streets that I feel are home. And so I always felt that I had done something constructive in the community, that I in some way, along with law enforcement, along with the other people in the office that were helping, that I had done something positive in the community by getting someone that I felt was completely dangerous, because there were several, and I would tell that to a jury in a jury trial, is a free and open society cannot handle this person. He cannot be left to be out on the streets by himself, based on what he had done, but also showing that could be his future course of conduct, but he's just too dangerous and can't be there anymore. On the judge side of it, and I tell people I probably deal with domestic violence more now as a judge than I ever did as a prosecutor, is because three of the judges handle protective orders. And so that's when somebody is seeking, because of violence perpetrated on them by a family member or a household member, that they're seeking protection of the court from that person, saying that person has to stay away from them. Between those kind of cases and adoptions. Adoptions are almost always a good feeling. because when you're presiding over an adoption, you're saying from this day forward, that child is as if born to you. And so you can see from those people how happy and excited they are to have that child. If the child's old enough, how happy and excited that child is that from now on, these are my parents. That just makes you feel good. If for nothing else, even though you may not have had a huge part in that, you get to observe it and you get to see such joy and happiness. I did one 30 minutes before you got here, and you get to observe the joy and happiness of the child as well as the parents going through an adoption.
If you had to tell somebody about Washington County, maybe somebody that had never been to Arkansas or never been to Washington County, what would you tell them?
That by and large, no place is without any flaws. But by and large, the people of Washington County are friendly people. They're helpful people. They're nice people. Charitable organizations, nonprofits, are like a cottage industry here. There seems to be so many people out trying to help other people. And by and large, everyone seems to be friendly and want others to succeed and want to help in any way, shape, or form that they can help other people. That, I would say, is about Washington County, is they're friendly people and they're helpful people, and they want to be helpful.
Tell me about some of your causes that you feel like are important that you've supported over the years personally.
Single Parent Scholarship Fund. I'm on my second term serving on the board for Single Parent Scholarship, and that's what is it? Rising tide floats all boats, raises all boats. It does something. It's good for everybody. I think that's a worthwhile organization. I mean, you're hard pressed to say, well, that's not a great charity, or you don't see too many of those. I enjoyed my time serving on the Art Center of the Ozarks board of directors. I like the fact that they were promoting a community theater with local singers, local actors. So I really enjoyed my time in the Art Center of the Ozarks. And a lot of the other multitude of charitable organizations, I personally may not be involved in them, but I will go to their fundraisers and try and support them financially, different charitable organizations in the area. And then the churches in this area, you see a lot of work that they do. CEO, Cooperative Emergency Outreach, is a collection of 12 or 13, 14 churches who try to help people in need. Seven Hills Homeless Shelter, Salvation Army. You've got so many people and organizations trying to make life better for people whose lives are not good. And I appreciate that.
You're also involved in a lot of stuff you do to support the sheriff's office, or like when they have events, I see you and Mr. Threet going to stuff. What are those kind of things?
Well, a lot of the organizations that the sheriff's office helps are not necessarily directly the sheriff's office. They have a smoker, and their administration are all good cooks. And so they volunteer a lot of their time going to different organizations to help out. And there's a lot of different golf tournaments that I won't play in because I'm not a particularly big fan of golf. It's time consuming. But I'll donate to be a whole sponsor. And if that includes lunch, I'll go out there and eat. I'm just not going to stand around in the sun and play golf for 3 or 4 hours because that just makes me sweat and tired. But the sheriff's office does do a lot of different benefits and is involved. Their fraternal order does shop with the cop. But Fayetteville and Springdale have active FOPs as well that do work in the community. My favorite thing about Washington County is, it'd have to be the people. I mean, that may sound cliched, But if you don't like the people, what in the world are you doing here? If you don't enjoy the people, and I'm not saying I like 100% of the people who live in Washington County, and I'm fairly certain 100% of the people who know me in Washington County don't like me. 100%, probably 99.9% like me. I don't know what the percentage would be. But if you don't like the people where you're living, what are you doing there? Washington County has great organizations, businesses, charitable organizations, attractive landscape, and you're close to different parks that you can go to, different things that you can get involved in. But if it weren't for the people, then there'd be no reason to be here. Or there'd be very little reason to be here. But I think the people make it worthwhile.